look
All
like you're in
right.
a much better, more visually compelling place than I am. That's for sure.
Yeah, we have
Looks
a
good.
nice little patio set up here. Thanks.
Good.
Yeah, so I'm excited to talk today about En Primeur, buying Bordeaux on futures in general. So I think we've discussed earlier, but let's talk a little bit about what En Primeur is, what the inherent value is in buying En Primeur, whether it just be monetary or provenance and that type of realm, and then let's dive into a little bit about how we selected the wines for this collection and 2020 kind of as a vintage, if you don't mind. So we'll start with En Primeur.
Yeah. So what is En Primeur? It is it's a fairly unique way of organizing selling wine, and it's more or less particular to Bordeaux. It harkens back to the 1700s when merchants would go to different estates and make commitments to purchase the wine while the fruit was still on the vine, basically. They would then take possession of the wine after harvest and vinification, mature and bottle those wines. In the sort of modern iteration of En Primeur, it is oriented around selling the wines while they're still in barrel. So in essence, in the late 70s, early 80s, this became a very popular way of promoting the vintage and also very helpful from a cash flow perspective for Bordeaux Chateau to be able to pre-sell these wines while they were still in barrel. And it just continued to gain momentum. Today, it's very much a tradition. And the process is that, folks from the trade will basically descend on Bordeaux in the spring. Usually it's the last week or two of March, and it's called En Primeur Week. And you'll have all these different trade members, whether they're importers, retail buyers, restaurateurs, going into Bordeaux. And the Chateau open their doors and present the opportunity for folks to taste these wines as barrel samples to get an impression of the vintage. At the same time, the key press are also out there tasting these wines and reviewing these wines while they're still in barrel. And then shortly thereafter, within a couple months thereafter, the En Primeur campaign typically will start. And in essence, the Chateau will offer allocations of these wines to their distribution network. In Bordeaux, the distribution network are négociants. So these are intermediaries that purchase the wines and ultimately distribute them globally. So the process will be for a company like Vintfolio, we would receive, when a winery releases their wines, we would receive allocations of these specific wines at the prices set from multiple négociants. And so, as an example, if a top producer like Chateau Lafite releases their wines on a given day, in that morning, in our inbox, we'd find offers from multiple négociants in different quantities, and we would ultimately try to aggregate those supplies. So again, it's a very efficient way of distributing allocations globally, and it's a very useful way for the Chateau to pre-sell these wines in advance. And that's more or less the system.
Yeah, no, that's a great overview. I will say, I think I realized I forgot to introduce you. So I'll say, for everyone listening, this is Adam Lapierre. He's the president of Vintfolio. He's also on our wine advising committee here at Vint, and they helped us put together this great collection of En Primeur wines. So yeah, I have two quick follow-up, notes / questions. Is one note, I guess with pricing over the past 15 years or so, it's been kind of, early, kind of outrageous around like 2010, 2011, and then it's become more reasonable, especially with this kind of COVID correction. Can you maybe touch on that a little bit? And I think it's interesting that pricing to your point, this negociant network basically used to help distribute all of these wines and was kind of necessary to really get the wines out there. But the prices actually spiked so much that Latour was just like, we're just going to sell these directly. We actually have so much demand, we don't really even need to go through intermediaries, starting in like 2012. I found that really interesting.
Yeah, I think the value of the system is that, again, it's a very efficient way of getting of distributing product. There is an advantage from the standpoint of a buyer, a retail buyer or an importer, in that in general, you would expect to be able to acquire the wines at the lowest possible price by buying them as futures. And that typically holds true. And there are certainly examples, historical examples, where that has, you're pointing out a couple of vintages where that hasn't held true because of just sort of the rising demand and the way that the price quality of a specific vintage relates to others, right? So there has to be that strategic element of looking at the physically available vintages, the current market pricing of those vintages, the quality of the wines that are being offered as futures, and ultimately the price set for futures needs to fit neatly within that context to ultimately deliver value to the buyer, or else there's not a compelling reason to buy those wines 2 years in advance. So there, it is a process for sure, and one that doesn't always hold true, but I think in the context of 2020, it definitely it's a good campaign, and one that I think does provide value for the buyer at this stage.
Yeah, and then are you of the camp that? Well, I actually went one step back. I know I was going to ask if you're of the camp that this is a trilogy for Bordeaux of 3 great years in a row. I would say that's pretty true. I haven't really heard much to differ, but what's kind of interesting to me, and I don't know, I think you said you have before gone and barrel tasted for these En Primeur.
Yes.
Can you describe a little bit about what the wine's kind of like at this age? Because it's kind of nuts to me that wines with tannins and structure that's supposed to age for 40, 50, 60 years and they're slathered with new oak are expected to be tasted 5 months after they're fermented.
Yeah, I mean, I think tasting futures and barrel samples in general can be very challenging. It is something that it's always directional versus really having a high degree of confidence, and so or an absolute degree of confidence, I should say. So when you look at the way that most of the critics score wines that are barrel samples, they give a range, and again, it's based on their best judgment, their tasting experience, but those wines are all ultimately retasted once they're in the bottle, because the barrel samples, in many cases, they're indicative and they may not represent the final composition of the blend. And again, you're tasting, a baby wine. It's just vinified. What is interesting, though, is I think the winemaking style in Bordeaux generally is evolving, and when I tasted, and also the vintages and the characteristics of the climate are changing as well. The last time that I went was in 2019, and we tasted the 2018 vintage in barrel, and actually it was pretty stunning on how approachable those wines were as barrel samples. Tannins were actually very ripe, soft. The wines were plush and really pretty pleasant to taste at that stage. But certainly it's again, you're really thinking about a lot of different factors, and you're really just trying to get a more of a directional feel for the quality of the vintage overall and how that fits in the context of the other vintages that are out there, and just get a general sense of quality to the extent that you can.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. That's really interesting to hear about the 2018s. I know it was some parts had some mildew issues that really produced good but small crops. So I know that impacted kind of the the ripening process. Well, can we talk? Let's talk a little bit about the 2020 vintage, and then some of the wines that we decided on for this collection. I don't know if you want to highlight certain producers, or we can go down the list. But I know we have all of the first gross, and then some strategic, second gross and other second tier, and right bank wines, of course, too.
Right. Yeah, I think the challenge between 2019 and 2020 vintages is there were no En Primeur weeks because of the COVID issues, and so we as merchants, pretty much the world, had to rely on the tastings from critics and their evaluation of quality. What a lot of the chateau ended up doing was preparing barrel samples and shipping them to the major wine critics wherever they were, and then they produced their notes, and again sort of formulated their overall impressions of the vintage. In terms of 2020 in general, it was certainly a vintage that had a unique set of challenges. It wasn't textbook perfect vintage. There were some frost issues. There was a good bit of rain in the early spring. Then in the summer, it was extremely dry. I think July was one of the driest months on record in Bordeaux. A lot of heat as well, some very high temperatures in August. So very precarious in a few different ways, which, one can really emphasize the difference in terroir from these different producers, sort of the natural benefits of a superior location, whether that is related to airflow or drainage or the ability to retain water. All these things are important factors. And again, just some vineyards are naturally inclined to deal with these challenges more readily, and others that are in less ideal sites tend to suffer. I think one of the saving graces of the vintage was there was a bit of rain in September, which helped, or late August rather, which helped to kind of relieve some of the stress issues that the vines were enduring. And then the harvest period was exceptional, dry and clear and very favorable. So that really enabled the wineries to pick in a very judicious way, in a very patient way, to optimize ripeness to the extent that was possible. So that was a very significant saving grace in terms of making sure that the ripeness, which was sort of stunted because of the extreme weather conditions in the summer, was able to continue after those bouts of rain, and ultimately enable folks to bring in fruit that was really high quality. In general, I think the consensus is that the vintage was not uniformly great, meaning there is some variation of quality. However, the top producers with the best vineyards tended to do better. That's really where our focus was in terms of selecting wines for the collection.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's something that I think people miss a little bit, is the reason that these certain like terroir, certain like chateau, I guess the top, first gross, are so great, is that even in the off years, they still produce a good to great wine, as opposed to, some vintages, any producer, not any producer, but, a lot of the different chateau can produce great wines because it's perfect weather. But when it is a little rockier or, not as too wet or too dry, that's when the kind of the good terroir really shines through.
Yeah.
Did you see were producers that were, more right bank or heavily on clay this year fare better just because of the clay holding the water, as opposed to, ones on more gravelly soils that might have been more impacted by that dry spell?
Yeah, I think free draining soils were certainly more likely to be impacted by those dry spells for sure. So there was more stress in those types of in those vineyards. And again, this is a very broad generalization. That being said, when the rains did come, they came in pretty significant doses in certain areas. And so in those instances where you have those free draining soils, that can be a benefit. So yeah, I think, and the amount of rain that was that fell on the right bank versus the left bank were also quite different. So yeah, I think those factors really come into play. And again, sort of on a case by case basis, it's very difficult to generalize.
Yeah, that makes sense. Are there any specific, I know, we work together to kind of craft a basket of 20 plus wines. So there's definitely a lot in there, looking both at value and ratings. But are there any like specific stars that you're just really, really excited about from this vintage that are in our collection in particular?
Yeah, well, unfortunately, like I said, I've not been able to taste any of these wines myself,
Right.
So have been really reliant on the critics, their tasting notes and assessments to orient myself around which wines are showing the best. But for us, I think obviously the first growths are always really interesting, and from a value proposition or an investment perspective, always make a lot of sense. My impression is, pretty much across the board, they've all performed very well. But I think Aubryon and La Mission Aubryon are two producers that I've been very excited about in the last few years in particular, and very excited to taste those wines when I have the opportunity. But of course, Lafite, Margaux are also exceptional producers on the left bank. So, and Mouton, of course, as well. Cheval Blanc and Angelus, I'm actually pretty interested in as well. I think the right bank had, from all accounts, performed extremely well. Cheval Blanc did not provide samples to any of the critics. Some chateaux were just not, I think, not willing to take the risk of how these samples would travel, so they opted just not to have the wines tasted at all. But I feel like Cheval Blanc is probably one that's going to perform extremely well, just considering what I know about how the harvest was on the right bank and what we've seen from other right bank producers like Angelus. Sounds like Smith-Ho Lafite is going to be another producer that really is firing on all cylinders as well. Also from Pessac-Léognan, which is where you're going to find Aubryon as well, and La Mission. So it sounds like that commune did extremely well. And then for us, the super seconds that always do well, Pontet-Canet, Cos d'Esternel, I think are always top performers. So very excited to see how those wines perform. And Trolong Mondo is one that we picked up a few cases for this collection, and they're really making fantastic strides in terms of quality. The former managing director of Cos d'Esternel went to work for them back in 2017, and they're making just exceptional wine. So this is one that's sort of a sleeper, I think, but one that we're really excited about.
Awesome. Yeah, no, I think when you touched on a couple there that I'm particularly excited about too, like Cheval Blanc, obviously I've heard, the right bank is, the wines are showing well from those who have tasted it, and it was a good vintage. But also the fact that they came out early with their pricing, and it'll only up a little bit from last year, which was better than 2018. So it's good for value purposes. Can you talk a little bit about Cos d'Esternel's? They have a special bottle this year, something that adds some value to the wines potentially over time. At least we've seen that with other producers.
Yeah, that's true. I think, in fact, Smith-Ho Lafite and Cos both have special packages this year. The Cos d'Esternel is a silk screen or a gold leaf package, which is looks quite ornate and pretty stunning. We've seen packaging like that from Mouton in 2000. They did a special package, and also Chateau Margaux in 2015. And in both examples, the prices of those wines have really gone through the roof. So, I think Chateau Margaux, as an example, the 2015 is trading for around $1,500 or $1,600 a bottle, which is a pretty substantial premium over adjacent vintages with a similar quality.
Awesome. Yeah, that's something I'm interested in, because it's, sometimes even producers sometimes will release special releases of the same wine, and just those special packs will bump it up.
Yeah.
So, well, that's exciting. I think now maybe we'll touch a little bit on, and I think those are all my questions. I think if you had anything particular you want to touch on, or we'll open it up to the audience here to see if anybody else has any cues. If you guys have any questions, you can just type it in the question and answer box, and I'll read them. Or if you want to ask verbally, I can try to unmute you as well. But just raise your hand. So
yeah, I mean, I think the only other thing that I would add is what we tend to see with futures is this release period, which happens over the summer, and then those wines that have been secured as futures will basically be purchased by collectors over time, and those wines will be physically available in 2023. So usually the producers will bottle those wines in the winter or spring of the year before release. So yeah, we would expect to have those wines in the late summer to early fall 2023. And then what happens typically is once the wines are physically available, they tend to be that tends to really create and stimulate a lot of activity as well, because you sort of have two different categories of collectors or buyers. Some that are really interested in getting the wines at the best possible price and making sure that they've secured the volumes that they're interested in. So they'll buy those wines as futures, and then when the wines are physically available, that tends to really create a flurry of activity. One of the things that we've seen with 2020, and it's a continuation of a trend, which is that there tends to be less wine released by the Chateau as futures. So the Chateau tend to be holding a bit more back. One, because many of them want to build up these library stocks so that they can release them in the future. And so that is something we've seen. I would say that, well, in the most extreme examples, the volumes released by certain Chateau were down by 35 or 40%. So that's another reason to think that these prices will go up fairly quickly, because there's less wine out on the market. And then, yeah, I think the other thing that we are cognizant of is the quality of the 2021 vintage, and also the physical availability of other recent releases. So, we're thinking about, one, what is the value proposition of these wines as futures from a quality perspective relative to other vintages that are on the market? What is the volume that's available of this current vintage? And looking forward, what's coming? And by all accounts, 2021 is going to be can be a fairly challenging vintage, and one that might be pretty small.
Okay, great. Well, it looks like we have a couple questions here. Let me read them off. One is, when the collection goes into bottle, before or after sale, typically. So I think you touched on that a little bit here, but you want to explain the difference between what we're buying right now versus what you were saying, if it's later released?
Right. So the wines that are sold as futures that we purchase now are still resting in barrel. The Chateau will bottle the entirety of a vintage in one go. So that will occur at the end of, again, at the late 2022, early 2023 is when those wines will be physically bottled. And all of the wines will be retained as bottled inventory, whether it's been being released at that point or being held back by the chateau and library stock. It's going to be held back as bottled goods.
Right. And then typically the En Primeur shares of your allocations aren't typically resold. So say like we're purchasing now, we typically will wait till after they're bottled and released, and that's when we'll be seeing that lift, because there's not really a lot of drive in us selling them again right now.
Correct.
Yeah, we haven't seen that appreciation yet. One other quick question is, why does a futures network or like an En Primeur type system, why is it just starting to take hold only with a few producers around the world? Like, why doesn't it exist really in the US right now, aside from like Ridge?
To sell wines as futures?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Well, I think it's something that requires one, a fair amount of critical mass in order to create enough awareness around the practice. Obviously, Bordeaux has done that, and it has become the standard for that market. I think it is more difficult for a single producer to affect a change or to get a lot of takeaway. Every producer is different, of course, and if a cult Napa winery that is in high demand and very limited in supply chose to do that, I'm sure they would have a strong response. But I think in general, part of it is just the idea that there's not quite as cohesive a focus or more or less that producers aren't also moving in lockstep in other regions. And also, I think, again, there has to be enough sort of liquidity, visibility, and global demand for the category in order to really create broad enough awareness for it to make sense.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. And the other piece about the Bordeaux futures, which is interesting, is back in the day, everybody literally went to the plots Bordeaux to kind of actually bid on these wines. Now it's done a little bit more remote, but what I found interesting is that is that central point where people know I can go here to find the futures during this time, and that's why other regions are now releasing their futures through the plots de Bordeaux as well,
right? Rather
than
we don't tend to see those wines coming out as futures in the sense that in the same sense as Bordeaux, in that most of the wines that are sold on the Place are new releases that are physically available. But certainly, I think it is it's a quite interesting network and system that can be very effective for producers, provided there's enough global demand and awareness of their brands.
That makes sense. And then last question we had is, with so many wines from both banks, how will we decide when to sell all of them or sell them as a unit? I'll just kind of touch on that real quick. Is basically to what you were saying, upon release, there tends to be a flurry of activity. So that's obviously a time that we could potentially look at it. But the answer kind of holds for us on the Vint side. We will look to sell the wines when we can get the proper returns or the best returns for our investors. So we're not going to commit now to saying we'll sell them right upon release or later. We have this window of time that we'll be looking at, and we'll work with people like Adam to help us make sure we optimize the returns where possible. So that's my main question. Thanks a lot for your time, Adam, and we look forward to having more of these conversations in the future. And I will make a note at the end of this, to Nick's point that he always says, our founder is all of any future facing statements, everything, we are not financial advisors, and any future statements are kind of speculation. So we're not guaranteeing any sort of return in any way. So I have to cover off on that at the end of all of my spiels now, just to make sure I didn't say anything. But thank you so much, Adam. This was great, and all right. I appreciate the time.
Pleasure, Billy. All right, take care.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.